The year was 1779. The place, Morristown, New Jersey. It was bitterly cold, and the Revolutionary War was in progress throughout the young country of America. In Valley Forge, the winter was cruel, with snows 4 to 6 feet deep. To make matters worse, George Washington's army did not have adequate shoes or clothing, and food was scarce. The soldiers slept in rude huts with only a few blankets. This was the year the British Army had suffered a major defeat in the North. After this defeat, the British Army moved the war to the South. As a result, the British turned their fury upon the rebellious southern colonies. Sir Henry Clinton headed the British expedition, sailing from New York along the treacherous North Carolina coast and on to South Carolina and Georgia. Savannah fell to the British. Charleston followed in defeat. The British Army then sent the American Army running at Camden, South Carolina. With the victory secure for the British Tories, General Clinton left Lord Charles Cornwallis to finish the destruction of the South. Lord Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson into the Western Carolinas to recruit American volunteers to fight for the British King. Meanwhile, Cornwallis gathered his forces for a sweep through the central Piedmont. It looked bad for the Patriots. There was only one Patriot army in the South fighting against a strong Tory army. Major Patrick Ferguson was a native of Scotland and was a 3-year veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was arrogant and proud and had worn the British uniform since he was 15 years old. Major Ferguson recruited, equipped, and trained his Tory forces, made up of American volunteers, in the small town called 96. He and his troops then swept northward. By the time he reached Gilberttown, near the present-day Rutherfordton, North Carolina, the only remaining resistance to the British Tories were the patriotic mountain people. From Gilberttown, Major Ferguson sent a threat to Colonel Isaac Shelby at Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee.
If you do not desist from opposition to British arms, I will march my army over the mountains and hang your leaders and lay waste your country with fire and sword.
Unfortunately, Major Ferguson did not know the temper and zeal of the tight-knit mountaineers beyond the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Rugged and independent, these mountaineers decided they would not tolerate Ferguson and his Tory army any longer. Upon receiving Ferguson's threat, Colonel Shelby saddled his horse and rode 40 miles to talk with Colonel John Sevier, the fiery commander of the Washington County Militia. Together, they laid their plans to surprise Ferguson and his Tories. They sent for the help of Colonel William Campbell of the Virginia settlement on the Clinch River and Colonel Charles McDowell of Burke County, North Carolina. On September 25th, 1780, 1,000 men mustered at Sycamore Shoals in Tennessee, armed with their long rifles. Wearing their buckskins and carrying their own provisions, these men were ready to cross the mountains and destroy Ferguson and his soldiers. Before leaving on their long mission, these hardy Overmountain men listened to a long prayer by the Reverend Samuel Dokes. At the end of his prayer, he urged the men to wield the sword of the Lord and Gideon. The next day it was raining as the men began their hard march up Gap Creek. They drove before them a herd of cattle, which would provide them with food and milk. That night, in order to keep their powder dry, they slept under the shelving rock on the Doe River. Morning came, and the men lined up for roll call. Snow was falling and was shoe-mouth deep as they moved down Roaring Creek. The herd of cattle was holding them back, so they left most of them behind. Fording the icy river as they came down North Toe Valley, the Overmountain men camped at Grassy Creek near Spruce Pine, North Carolina. Leaving Grassy Creek, the men separated into 2 columns, with Colonels Shelby and Sevier taking the North Cove, and Colonel Campbell and the Virginians going down Turkey Knob. Coming together again, the Overmountain men crossed the Linville Mountain, on the old Yellow Mountain Road and reached Quaker Meadows on the Catawba River. In the meantime, Colonel Benjamin Cleveland of Wilkes County was preparing his men to join the other Overmountain men to fight the British. He stood on top of Rendezvous Mountain, turned his horn to the north, and gave 3 long blasts. He then turned to the southeast and to the southwest, giving more blasts from his tremendous horn. Hearing the signals from the horn, Colonel Cleveland's men saddled their horses and galloped to Rendezvous Mountain. After assembling at Rendezvous Mountain, 350 volunteers from Surrey and Wilkes counties proceeded to Fort Defiance in present Caldwell County, where they camped. They were joined by William Lenore, a captain in one of Cleveland's companies. Leaving Fort Defiance, the volunteers, under the leadership of Colonels Cleveland, Joseph Winston, and William Graham, proceeded to Quaker Meadows to join the other Overmountain men. The Patriot Army was now about 1,400 strong. They took up the march again on October 2nd. They were 16 miles from Gilberttown, where Ferguson's troops were camping. The Overmountain men had been traveling for 8 days. Colonel Cleveland formed his troops in a circle and said, "The enemy is at hand, and we must up and at them. Now is the time for every man of you to do his country a priceless service, such as shall lead your children to exult in the fact that their fathers were the conquerors of Ferguson." The colonels, Cleveland and Shelby, told the men, "If any of you want to back out, step 3 paces in the rear." No one moved. Next, Colonel Shelby gave a message. "When we encounter the enemy, don't wait for the word of command. Let each of you be your own officer and do the best you can, taking every advantage that chance may throw your way." When the Overmountain men arrived in Gilberttown, Major Ferguson was not there. Deserters from the Patriot Army slipped around and told Ferguson that the Overmountain men were coming, so he left immediately. Major Ferguson became uneasy about his position and sent an urgent request to Lord Cornwallis for help, but he received no answer. In desperation, he issued a proclamation pleading for help from those loyal to the king. Criers carried the message to all of the local towns.
The backwatermen have crossed the mountains. McDowell, Hampton, Shelby, and Cleveland are at their head. So ye know what ye had to depend upon. If you choose to be degraded forever and ever by a set of mongrels, say so at once, and let your women turn their backs upon ye, and look out for real men to protect them.
Upon hearing that another colonel by the name of Elijah Clark and his Georgia Patriots were marching to join the Overmountain men, Major Ferguson realized that he was in trouble. With no promise of reinforcements, he decided to join Cornwallis near Charlotte. By now, the Overmountain men had been joined by South Carolinians under the command of Colonel James Williams and additional North Carolinians known as the South Fork Boys. They met at a point where the Green and Broad Rivers join. At dawn, 700 men with good horses were selected to speed up the pursuit, and they were sent after Major Ferguson. The next evening, the Overmountain men reached Cowpens, South Carolina. Cowpens was the name of a large cattle ranch owned by an English Tory. Still hoping for reinforcements, Major Ferguson continued his march towards Charlotte. The British Tories followed the old Cherokee Ford Road between Buffalo and Kings Creek. They forded Kings Creek, went through Stony Gap, and came to a rocky ridge of upland of a larger range of mountains known as Kings Mountain. The British troops went up the wooded slopes and to the top of the ridge, where Major Ferguson decided to stand and wait for the Overmountain men. And here they came. Exhausted by their long ride, the men and horses needed rest, but they were determined to find Ferguson before nightfall. By 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, they were in the woods at the base of Kings Mountain. With trees and rocks providing the cover they needed, the Patriots formed into columns led by Campbell, Sevier, Shelby, and Cleveland. At right center was Campbell and his Virginians, followed by Shelby. Sevier, McDowell, and Winston took the right flank, and Williams, Chronicle, and Cleveland's troops made up the left flank. With their nerves on edge, the Patriots were ready to fight. 16-year-old James Collins in Chronicles Regiment crammed 3 or 4 musket balls in his mouth to prevent thirst and to be ready to reload his gun quickly. The men moved swiftly and caught Ferguson and his men by surprise. Firing their guns and yelling at the top of their lungs, dodging behind trees and rocks, the Patriots were driven back down the ridge. Above the noise of battle could be heard the sound of Major Ferguson's shrill silver whistle as he directed his troops. 3 times the Patriot troops were driven down the mountain. By then, other Patriot troops had climbed the mountain and Ferguson's army was completely surrounded. The battle was bloody. Colonel William Chronicle was shot and killed. Colonel James Williams was shot and died later. The Patriots were closing in, but Ferguson could not be stopped. 2 horses were shot down from under him, but he mounted a 3rd horse and slashed down the white surrender flags his men were holding up. His sword broke as he made an attempt to break through the Patriots' lines. Shots rang out, and one penetrated Ferguson's head. He fell from his horse with 1 foot caught in the stirrup. His men cut him loose and laid him out of the line of fire near some rocks. Word quickly spread that Major Ferguson was dead, and the British Tories panicked. White flags of surrender began to wave in the smoke-filled air. The Patriots, nerves still raw, continued to fight until Colonel Campbell pleaded with them.
For God's sake, don't shoot. It is murder to kill them now, for they have raised the flag.
In one day, the Battle of Kings Mountain was over. The proud and arrogant Major Ferguson had boasted that nothing could remove him from that mountain. He lay dead, and 1,100 of his men were wiped out, either dead or wounded. The brave and independent Overmountain men and other Patriots lost 28 killed and 62 wounded. They had won the battle. Led by Colonel Campbell, they gave 3 loud shouts for liberty, then quietly dissolved back into the countryside. This was the battle that changed the course of the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Kings Mountain was over. In 1 brief hour, the Overmountain men defeated the Tories, and their leader, Major Patrick Ferguson, lay dead. The British had definitely underestimated the Overmountain men and their determination to protect their homes and to keep their independence. Major Ferguson and his dead soldiers were hastily buried on Kings Mountain. The Overmountain men quickly gathered their prisoners for the march towards North Carolina. There was a rumor that the hated Colonel Tarleton was on his way to Kings Mountain to do battle. Exhausted but determined, the Overmountain men covered some 32 miles a day. Finally, they reached Quaker Meadows, the home of Major Joseph McDowell, where they could rest. Here at Quaker Meadows, the men began to separate and return to their mountain homes. They had done the job they had gone to Kings Mountain to do. No longer would they be threatened by the British. The Tory prisoners were to be taken to Hillsborough, where they were exchanged for Patriot prisoners of war. Lacey and his men went back to South Carolina. Shelby and Sevier and the Virginia footmen headed back across the mountains. Colonels Cleveland, Winston, and McDowell's troops started for Hillsborough to deliver the Tory prisoners to General Gates. Along the way, so many prisoners escaped that when they reached Hillsborough, they had only 130 prisoners to exchange for Patriot prisoners of war. Leaving Hillsborough, Colonel Benjamin Cleveland of Wilkes County headed for the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was a large man, weighing over 300 pounds. Over in the Blue Ridge Mountains, there lived several well-known Tory and British sympathizers. One of these was Zachariah Wells, who was suspected as acting as a spy for the British. After arriving home, Colonel Cleveland decided to look for Zachariah Wells and to question him about his spying activities. He rounded up about a dozen militiamen to go with him. Old Zachariah lived on the New River, a few miles below the forks of the river. He was riding up the trail beside the river when he saw Colonel Cleveland and his men riding towards his home. No one could mistake Cleveland because of his size, and so Zachariah recognized him immediately. He took aim with his musket and fired, striking Cleveland in the leg with a musket ball. He then turned and hurriedly rode off into the woods. While 2 of the men took care of Cleveland's wounds, the rest of the men took off after Zachariah and caught him. Returning with Zachariah to the banks of the river, one of the men shouted, "Get a rope!" They tied him to a large sycamore tree and immediately called a court together. One man was a justice of the peace, so a trial was held, and Zachariah was charged, tried, and sentenced to be hanged. Zachariah protested violently.
No, no, I am innocent of the charges.
But his protest fell on deaf ears. The tough, rough mountain militiamen had seen too much of the Tories' destruction of the South. They were determined that the Tory sympathizers would be wiped out. A rope was attached to a large limb of the sycamore tree. When Zachariah saw what his fate was to be, he said,
I want to say something. I am innocent of the charges that you have brought against me. I have done no wrong. Just to prove to you that I am innocent, if you hang me, there will never be any grass that will grow under this tree ever again.
Despite his pleadings, the militiamen hanged Zachariah Wells and rode towards home, leaving him hanging from that tree. The next morning, bright and early, 2 of the militiamen decided to go and cut the body down and take it to Zachariah's family. They would then inform the family of what had happened. When they arrived at the scene of the hanging, there was only the frayed end of the rope hanging there. The body of Zachariah had disappeared. The men frantically searched the river and the surrounding area, but the body could not be found. Did his family find the body and cut him down? They rode to his home and demanded that his frightened family produce the body. Shocked to know that Zachariah had been hanged, the family denied any knowledge of his whereabouts. Where was the body of Zachariah Wells? It was never found. The curse that Zachariah Wells had put upon the ground beneath the hanging tree came to pass. For 160 years, the ground was bare in the circle under the limb where Zachariah's lifeless body hung for a short time. Today, the tree is gone, toppled by the flood of 1916 and washed away in the Great Flood of 1940. No one remembers now where the tree even stood. Was Zachariah Wells innocent? Who knows? Somewhere along the banks of the New River, in a secret place, is a large circle on the ground where nothing grows. It is called the Devil's Ground.